What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Chill, where I, Graham G.S. and Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network. Today, we're talking the premiere episode of WWE Break It Down, focusing on Drew McIntyre's career. Now, this is a new show, like I said, on the WWE Network, premiered last night. I think around 8, 9 o'clock Eastern time on the network. Not after anything in particular. Usually they debut these things like after Raw, after a pay-per-view. This was kind of randomly thrown up on Sunday night, which was kind of cool. And no, looking at the title, it has nothing to do with D-Generation X. Rather, it's superstars. Instead of looking back on like pictures of their career, a lot like we saw with Photo Shoot, they're looking back at various videos and matches and moments from their career in WWE, which is super cool. Photo Shoot's a good show, but this one I think is even better and has more potential to be more entertaining and enlightening and informative. Because with the pictures, you kind of see a picture, which is cool, and they elaborate on it for about a minute or two, and then they move on. McIntyre really went in depth here. Maybe it was just because McIntyre was a great guest, but McIntyre really went in depth here with each match, moment, period of his career that they discussed, and there was still so much left on the table. This episode is only 15 minutes, but they could have gone a lot longer than that, like almost an hour with everything he's accomplished and done throughout his very decorated career in WWE. So the first match that we see is of him versus Zack Ryder, of all people, from the October 12, 2007 edition of SmackDown, so over a dozen years ago. This was before he was the chosen one, before it was really a certified, set in stone WWE main roster debut. He had just come through, I don't even know if he was in FCW at that point. They might have just fast forwarded him right to the main roster, I think. But he talked about how Wade Barrett was arriving in America just 3 weeks after him. So he actually debuted on SmackDown first. So he didn't really have much of a chance to think or react going into that match, going into his main roster debut. He was just kind of thrown out there cold. He had mentioned that it was literally 4 weeks earlier that he was watching SmackDown with his buddies at his house or an apartment or whatever, and literally a month later, he was on SmackDown wrestling Zack Ryder. Stephanie told him right before the match backstage, listen, they got to change your last name. Galloway, is that your real last name? Yes, it is. We can't really use that, so go find a new last name. So he and Michael PSAs rushed over to the talent relations office, I believe it was, and they ran down a list of Scottish, I think it was Scottish, because he is Scottish, Scottish last names. And they went through the whole list, A down to Z. And they got to McDonald, and he's like, oh, I know a Scott McDonald, or not a Scott McDonald, a Drew McDonald. And maybe he didn't, and he just didn't want to use the name because it sounds like it sucks. Drew McDonald sounds like a stupid-ass name. I can only imagine the puns that would be made off McDonald's and stuff like that. So thankfully they went with Drew McIntyre, which works a lot better. It's a cool name. And they went with it so fans could chant him, McIntyre, 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 whatever. So that's really smart, too, while thinking of a name. Those are the things that you have to think of when you're coming up with your in-ring name. Is it something fans can get behind, cheer for, chant when I'm a babyface? So, interesting tidbit here, as he points out, as he was making his way to the ring, the Titantron video still said Galloway, even though they announced him as Drew McIntyre, which was interesting. I wasn't watching at that point, so I never knew that until I saw it here and he mentioned it here, which was cool. He talked about how the match went fine, but he had no idea where the hard camera was, and he had really no idea what was going on. And he faced, I think, Kurt Hawkins the next week. He beat the Major Brothers, which is interesting because he just beat Ryder and Hawkins recently on Raw like a week or two ago, which is interesting. And then right after that, he disappeared back to FCW because obviously he wasn't ready for the main roster. The next match that we see is of him versus John Morrison from the 2009 TLC pay-per-view, the inaugural TLC pay-per-view. By that point, he'd been wrestling for a few years. He thought he was prepared. He thought he was ready. Obviously, he wasn't in retrospect. But at the time, he was feeling confident. He calls Morrison one of his favorite opponents, even still to this day. He also talked about how winning the Intercontinental Championship that night was one of his dreams coming into WWE, how it was something he always dreamed of doing. And things were going well beyond his expectations. Being on the main roster, being called the Chosen One, handpicked by Vince McMahon himself in storyline. And he also talked about here, he revealed this, and maybe he's talked about this before, but he actually didn't know about the Chosen One promo going into that segment with McMahon on SmackDown back in 2009. He was just told that he'd be out there with Vince, he knew his lines, but he didn't know that Vince was going to call him the Chosen One and really handpick him to be a future world champion, which is kind of crazy. He said, when people ask him, oh, would you change anything? He said, no, not at all, because he could feel the pressure of being the hand-picked superstar by Vince himself. But in retrospect, he wouldn't change everything, because everything he did and accomplished at that point and every point, after that was all a part of his journey he talked about. He also talked about how he was very close to crying when he won the Intercontinental Championship at that point, because it was, again, something he was dreamed of doing going into his WWE career, and how he partied with Sheamus afterward. He told a funny story how Sheamus actually overshadowed him that night, because that was the same show where Sheamus became WWE champion only mere months into his main roster run as well. And they're really good friends, so they partied afterwards with their respective titles. We see video of his match with Oney Lorcan from NXT in April 12th, 2017, almost a decade removed from his SmackDown debut. So this is where he talks about NXT just in general. So he said when he came back, his contract had just lapsed with Impact. He actually said Impact Wrestling by name. The contract had just lapsed, and there were a lot of rumors going on at that point, whether he would stick with Impact, go to another company, what he was doing, that they offered him a lot of money to stay there and be their world champion, which I think he later confirmed in interviews, if I'm not mistaken. But he said no, and he wanted to go to Japan or do whatever. He was contemplating his next career move. So, when Regal got in touch with him, who he's close with, he told him to speak to Triple H. And he and Triple H came to terms on going to NXT first, and Triple H was obviously aware of his Evolve work, because Triple H not owned NXT, or rather, owned Evolve, but he was working with Evolve at that point. Evolve and NXT had this working relationship where they was kind of a bit of a feeder system, where they would take Evolve talent, put them in NXT, and vice versa. And McIntyre, not really part of that process, but at one point, he was the reigning Evolve champion, so Triple H was already aware of that. So they both agreed that NXT was the place for him to return to, and then soon after that, he returned at TakeOver Orlando. They thought that was the perfect spot for him to come back at over WrestleMania 33 weekend. He told a funny story how the day of that event, he had like a match to work at some indie promotion, did some media interviews with SiriusXM, and then met his wife outside of the arena to change into his suit right before the show. And then he ran out there as part of the audience, and they showed him on screen. I was at that show. It was an amazing moment. And then it became official that he had re-signed with NXT, or WWE on the whole. He also talked about how it was 10 seconds before they showed him on camera that he actually panicked, not thinking, or rather thinking that the fans wouldn't know who he was or remember who he was. Because, he was only gone for 2 or 3 years. That's kind of a long time in WWE time. And of course, that wasn't an issue. People reacted huge. It was the biggest pop of the night on that show. And people were super psyched to see McIntyre back in WWE. So he gets to the match with Lorcan, who was his first match back on TV in NXT. He never really got to experience NXT fully the first time around, because he did a few matches there back in like 2012 before he got put in 3MB. So this was kind of his first real run in NXT, and he called Lorcan one of his favorite opponents, a sprint of a match, and it was a great match. If you haven't seen it, it's on the network if you want to check it out. But he talked about how NXT at that point had become a brand of its own, and he would say that in interviews all the time, that NXT is not developmental, it's a third brand. And he also talked about how during his time in WWE the first time around, he learned from all the top names, including, The Undertaker, Kane, Batista, Rey Mysterio. They were all on SmackDown when he first started out in 2007. Upon coming back a decade later, they were all gone. So he kind of assumed the role of locker room leader in NXT. Now, it was his responsibility to kind of replace them in that role, at least for NXT. The next match he talks about is against Bobby Roode from TakeOver Brooklyn 3 from later that August. He talked about how he felt bad for Roode going into that matchup because he felt like he was going to war after the entrance that he had for that NXT Championship main event. And it was a really cool entrance. They kind of go all out with the TakeOver main event entrances, and they have in recent years. And that was the year where he had like the Scottish bagpipes and everything, kind of similar to what he had at WrestleMania this year, just not nearly as cool because it wasn't as big of a stage, obviously. But he also talked about how the first time he was in WWE, he didn't really have too many big singles matches, just because, he won the Intercontinental Championship, and then it was soon after that where he was promised things that didn't come to fruition, and he kind of fell down the totem pole, got put in 3MB, and then got fired. So he didn't really have too many breakout singles matches in the company. Never really got a big entrance until now. So earning that moment really meant the world to him. He talks about how he hates the word deserve, but he felt like he had earned it and earn that entrance, earn that championship win. Called that period a really fun period for himself in NXT, and that Rude was also really doing well going into that matchup at the time. And McIntyre said that he really benefited from not being your typical babyface, because Bobby Roode, although he was a great heel, had that great entrance theme going for him, the whole glorious thing, and people were cheering that too. So if McIntyre was a cookie-cutter babyface, he probably wouldn't work as well against Roode as he did. So winning the championship on that show was a significant moment for him, and he said that everything was worth it that he endured up to that point was all worth it for simply that moment of becoming the new NXT champion. Of course, they don't cover the Undisputed Era Adam Cole debut stuff where he attacked McIntyre right afterward, but that's not really neither here nor there on this episode and pertains to McIntyre. But the final match that he talks about was with Shane against The Undertaker and Roman Reigns from last year's Extreme Rules pay-per-view back in July. So before they even talk about the match itself, we see a flashback to a March 19th, 2010 episode of SmackDown, where he actually faced The Undertaker one-on-one. And prior to that point, the whole gimmick that he had going at the time as the Intercontinental Champion was that he was undefeated. I think Matt Hardy beat him one time, Kane beat him another time, but he, in storyline, had those losses expunged. For whatever reason, I don't know why they did that. And then he faced Undertaker, which was his first official loss in WWE. So going into that match, he wanted all the confidence and advice that he could get. So he talked to Wade Barrett, who was a really good friend of his. They were filming NXT Season 1, which Barrett was a part of earlier on that day. So we tried to talk to Barrett before the match, kind of get him hyped up for the match with The Undertaker, because it's the fucking Undertaker of all people. And he said that Barrett blew him off because he also had a big match later on in the show, or before the show, whatever, on NXT TV. So McIntyre looks at the lineup and sees that Barrett is facing Skip Sheffield, a.k.a. Ryback, which is obviously a nothing match. It was whatever, but Barrett was really nervous because it was probably one of his first big matches on NXT TV. So he said that Barrett later apologized because he didn't realize that McIntyre also had a match, but that it was the caliber of a match with The Undertaker. So McIntyre said that he was instructed by the people in the back to keep a straight face for his entire entrance, because this was one of the rare instances where Taker came out first and not second, because it's a small thing, but actually a really big thing, because Taker almost always comes out second because of his long, elaborate entrance. It's very rare that Taker comes out first, but he did in this match. So McIntyre was kind of put in a precarious position going into that match with The Undertaker, saying that he had to keep a straight face for that entire time walking down to the ring, locking eyes with the dead man, kind of staying serious and looking like as much of a threat as he can against The Undertaker, which he obviously wasn't, even though he was unofficially undefeated at the time. Saying that the match, in his mind, could not be taken seriously. Looking back on it now, it's a complete joke because he wasn't the same guy that he is today. And actually even says that now is the time to do that match, not 10 years ago, but rather in 2019, 2020. So he talks about the match with Shane against Taker and Reigns from Extreme Rules, saying that they found out that their tag team match was not only happening, but kicking off the pay-per-view. And it would have been a fun match regardless, because, Shane's always willing to do everything. Roman Reigns is a great hand in the ring, and Taker is just the fucking Undertaker. But no one involved in that match, he says, wanted to have an easy match. They wanted to go out there and steal the show, which arguably they did. They had one of the better matches, if not the best match on that show. Surprisingly enough, I really had no expectations for that match, but they went out there and friggin' killed it. So anyway, he talks about how he wanted to go face-to-face with The Undertaker, see what the reaction was. He did. The crowd went nuts. And he knew that, okay, this is something that we could always revisit down the road because the crowd's into it. And they went nuts, and it was kind of a cool moment for him. He also talked about how that was his favorite match of the match by far, was going face-to-face with The Undertaker, staring him down, and how the storytelling is what it's all about. And that match was filled with it. So to close this thing out, he talks about how his career has been unique. He can't really recall many people who grew up in WWE, left, and then came back. Had the successful career that he did on the indie scene, only to be re-signed a few years later. He's had a lot of ups and downs over the course of his career in WWE and beyond, but he's always looking to see how he can improve from where he is now and what he can do to move forward and be that locker room leader that he aspires to be, wanting to be the face of Monday Night Raw, which he's on Raw right now, so it's going to take some time for him to assume that role as the face of the flagship show, but he wants to lead Raw against SmackDown now that the brand split is back, really kind of reignite that brand rivalry, that brand feud, that brand supremacy storyline, both in and out of the ring, in real life as well, that we kind of had 10 years ago when he first started out in the company. He was on SmackDown. And he says that I'm going to be steering that ship as far as I'm concerned in terms of kind of being the guy to be on Monday Night Raw and being the person that people look up to as the face of the flagship show and being the person that runs Raw as their top guy. So hopefully at some point we can see that. Right now he's kind of floundering in the undercard and matches with Ryder and Hawkins and fucking Matt Hardy, people like that. Like, you know, it's a good thing he's winning, but he could be doing a lot more than he is right now. But I thought this was a great episode of Break It Down, a very good first episode of the show. Has a lot of potential where they break down matches over the course of their career and they share stories. Again, it depends who they're talking about here, but McIntyre seemed to have been a great first guest, talking about everything from his original debut in 2007 to his first ever Intercontinental Championship victory over 10 years ago, to his return to NXT, the Bobby Roode stuff, coming back to the main roster, and there's even more they didn't delve into that would have been interesting as well, like the 3MB stuff, which was so stupid, but it would have been cool to hear him talk about that as well. But this was a great first episode of Break It Down. Check it out right now on the WWE Network. Only about 15 minutes in length, so again, it's short, sweet, straight to the point, but full of stuff and stories that you probably weren't aware of prior to watching it. So with all that being said, be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share a video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content. On that note, we'll probably be breaking down whatever airs after Raw tonight, which at this point, I'm not exactly sure what it is. If it's a new Table for 3, Ride Along, they usually air something new after Raw. I'm not exactly sure at this current point what it is. But whatever it is, I'll probably be watching it and reviewing it at some point. So with that being said, guys, have a great rest of your week. I'm Graham G. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.